What if the person running to represent you could make sure they always win, no matter who you vote for? What if they had the power to choose who votes in their election? Almost always, politicians can influence the racial and geographic makeup of their districts. And surprise, surprise, they've been known to use this power to keep themselves and their party in power. It's called gerrymandering. And today, we'll look at how manipulating a basic process of democracy, drawing electoral maps, can decide who votes and who wins in an election. We'll also look at solutions. In the US, they take two forms: the Voting Rights Act and independent electoral commissions. The Voting Rights Act has slowly been whittled away by conservative courts, but truly independent electoral commissions show promise. They're still pretty rare in the US, but they all share the same origin story, and maybe that can give us a reason to hope. We'll talk about all that right now on the politics of democracy. Before we dive in, a quick second of background. Most democracies regularly redraw their electoral maps to keep up with changes in population. As some areas see their populations grow and some shrink, the boundaries of electoral maps and districts shift so that each district has roughly equal numbers of people. In the US, each federal congressional district holds about 760,000 people, which, by the way, is extraordinarily, ridiculously huge, but is a topic for another video. It's the process of redrawing the maps where elected legislators make themselves safer and weaken voters who might oppose them. This creates some problems. 4 big buckets of problems. First, distortion of voters' will. Generally speaking, we expect if half the people vote for one party, that party will win half the seats. But the whole point of gerrymandering is to carve up the map to maximize the chances your party wins the most seats with the smallest number of votes. One of many, many examples. In the 2018 federal congressional election, Democrats did particularly well for them in Texas. They got 47% of the House of Representatives vote. That got them 13 of the 36 seats that had been allocated to Texas. If you're a math whiz, you'd know Democrats should get about 17 of those seats. Republican gerrymandering designed a map that allowed their party to capture 23 of the seats. That's almost 2/3 of the seats with only half the votes. Do this in enough states and you can win a majority of the seats in the House without winning a majority of the votes. And that is the ultimate goal of gerrymandering. Keep a majority of the seats and keep power even without a majority of the votes cast for your party. Think about this. In 2022, the congressional election, Republicans only had 9 more seats than Democrats. In a close election, a few good gerrymanderings can make the difference between being in power and not. Second, underrepresentation of minority populations. This is done by either packing or cracking. In packing, a map is drawn to create a district that packs the voters that share a common trait, very often black voters in the US, into that one district. So yes, they have enormous outsized influence in electing that representative, but their numbers will be so small in all the other districts to essentially eliminate their power. In cracking, a group of voters, again very often black voters in the US, see their power diluted by splitting them amongst many districts. That way, they don't have enough power to elect anyone to represent their interests and views. Third, lack of accountability. Because the politicians have drawn their districts so they're not competitive, a lot of them are almost assured of getting reelected. They might face corruption charges or criticism for ridiculous behavior or extreme positions, but they don't really worry because their district is designed to have many, many voters that won't vote for the other party. And that leads to, in the US, number 4, extremist candidates. These politicians don't worry so much about reaching out toward the middle and compromising to make effective legislation. They worry much more about losing out in a primary to a candidate who is further to the extreme and more appealing to a small number of hardliners. So, solutions. For decades, both state courts and federal courts have made rulings under the Voting Rights Act to try to reduce the effects of gerrymandering on black voters. In June of 2023, the Supreme Court found Alabama was violating the Voting Rights Act by only making one black majority district out of the 7 the state is allocated, even though more than a quarter of the population is black. Essentially, there should have been a second district with a large black population, but Alabama's legislature, with a Republican majority, had drawn the map to ensure the black population would really be able to influence the outcome in only one of the 7 seats. The court told Alabama to go back and redraw its maps so that at least one more district would have a majority of black voters to give them influence over the outcome. Alabama Republicans said, "Oh, but you know what? We'd very much like to keep the long tradition of racial inequity and marginalization we're world famous for." And they drew a map that threads the needle between meeting the legal requirements, but still keeping the smallest number of black voters in a second district. After more hearings and more appeals, the Federal Circuit Court finally said, "You know what, Alabama? How about we draw the map for you?" They assigned a special master who drew 2 districts with a significant share of black voters, giving them influence over who would win those 2 seats. So, happy ending? Well, this case was a bit of an outlier. State and federal courts, especially the U.S. Supreme Court, have been shifting away from enforcing the Voting Rights Act. Just back in March of 23, they refused to even look at a very similar case out of Kansas. There, Republicans put the state's only majority-minority county into 2 separate congressional districts, where their votes are outweighed by white majorities. They cracked it apart to dilute the power of black voters. In upholding the changes, the Kansas Supreme Court found that, 1, the groups that brought the case didn't prove Republicans used race as a predominant factor, and 2, the Kansas Constitution lets lawmakers consider partisanship when drawing the electoral maps. So, in short, let's call the courts and enforcement of the laws inconsistent. They can't really be counted on to make sure that voters get districts that represent their community while hopefully maintaining some level of competitiveness. Actually, this is a good time to talk about why competitive districts are a good idea. I mean, obviously it makes politicians have to earn your vote. They can't just rely on their party label to get them in. But I think whatever your political leanings, you want to live in a competitive environment that forces legislators to balance the larger needs of the electorate against the will of a narrow base. Plus, when a politician is in a district that's been drawn to protect them, they're really answerable to the party elites and the wealthy donors who influence how those lines are drawn. By the way, if you're on the blue team, you should know it's not just those villainous Republicans who engage in gerrymandering. Democrats do it too. You can check out the failing grade Princeton's gerrymandering project gave Illinois for its very uncompetitive map that creates significant Democratic advantage. And even if you agree with Democrats generally, they're drawing the maps to their advantage, not yours. The more they're able to gain and keep power without having to answer to voters and thus to public opinion, the more remote and removed they become from the people they're supposed to serve. Gerrymandering breeds corruption, no matter which party is doing it. But then you might say Democrats are doing it because Republicans are doing it. And I get the argument that gerrymandering in places like Illinois might be the only way that Dems can balance out what Republicans are doing in places like Kansas. But some really important principles are being undermined here. When we decide our party's got to do what it's got to do to win, we're saying it's more important to have power than respect democratic processes. It's better to manipulate the system than try and reform it. So, what's the answer? Well, here's something that might be both fair and not tear at the fabric of democracy. Independent electoral commissions. 4 states have entirely independent electoral commissions: Arizona, California, Colorado, and Michigan. They don't have elected politicians on them, and the legislature can't override their decisions. If you live in a place like New York, you might think I forgot about you. But even though New York has an electoral commission that draws the maps, the legislature has to approve them. And it's led to many court battles and made for a highly politicized process. The truly independent commissions have final say. They draw electoral maps based on things like keeping communities of interest together and keeping districts geographically compact. The exact criteria varies, and I could geek out on all of that. And if you'd like me to, let me know in the comments down below. So, do they work? The Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation compared Arizona to states that let legislators draw the maps. Their study found the Arizona approach fosters increased competition in districts, and that recent results were essentially perfectly proportional, with Democrats gaining 45% of votes and 44.4% of House seats. It also found that 80% of state legislative districts became more competitive since the state started using an independent commission. In California, a study out of USC found that electoral maps drawn by commissioners there led to more diverse political representation. Over a decade, the percentage of Latinx and Asian American members of the U.S. House delegation doubled, and the number of Latinx, African American, and Asian American state legislators also went up. Oh, in California, districts may not be drawn for the purpose of favoring or discriminating against an incumbent political candidate or political party. So, Kansas, feel free to copy California's homework. Colorado and Michigan have only had independent commissions since 2018, and there's only been one redrawing of the map since then. Colorado added a congressional seat, and it looks like it's been drawn to be competitive, with the other 7 pretty much maintaining the status quo. So maybe not a lot to learn from there yet. But Michigan's new commission seems to have corrected some serious problems. Before the latest redistricting, when the process was controlled by Republicans, the Brennan Center for Justice described it as having an extreme level of partisan bias in favor of Republicans. Now, in the 2022 election, the vote split about 51-49% in favor of Democrats. That led to Michigan sending 7 Democrats and 6 Republicans to Washington. The state legislature had a 56-54 Democratic majority and a 20-18 Democratic majority in the Senate, in the state Senate, that is, so all pretty close. But the map, as drawn by the commissioners, reduced Detroit's representation. That's the largest black majority city in the U.S., and has been criticized for disenfranchising black voters. I think this points to the fact that there are conflicting, maybe really complicated views of what fair looks like. Is competitive always what we're striving for? Or do we want to make sure that marginalized communities also have sufficient representation? And there's a tension there for sure, and likely deserving of its own video. So at the start, I said independent electoral commissions share an origin story. They were all put in place through citizens' initiatives, where voters essentially forced their elected officials to create them. The key to getting fairer elections, it seems, at least in the US, is citizens organizing, getting measures on the ballot, and going out and voting for them, making it happen for themselves. So, using independent commissions, essentially reducing the power of elected officials to manipulate the system, seems to make things more competitive, keep politicians answerable to voters, and in some cases can even increase representation for marginalized groups. Is that enough to have a little bit of optimism? Is there any reason for hope in this political climate? And back to that tension. Should we go for maximum competitiveness? Always. If so, how do we make sure that marginalized and minority voices get heard? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you've enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more, hit the like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.